This is now we're starting our third year and our third book. So this is pretty freaking cool. I love it. Um, and so we've always started with what we jokingly called our Jeff Lucas disclaimer. And we are not all attorneys, although there are some on here, and everything discussed is just personal opinions and may not stand up in court. Our hope is that we can open the discussions up to a broader audience and have these ideas recorded for the next generation. There are some great high profile boundary surveyors and even some college students from across the country on this Zoom meeting. And I hope that we can all gain a bit of knowledge from these discussions. So we love the conversations we've had on the last two books. And I think it all stemmed back to the Pincushion Effect, which is why we really wanted to kind of discuss this book. And so we thank Jeff for allowing us to use the screen share of the PDF and then being able to have the discussions on this. And then when we did reach out to Jeff, he thought maybe a lot of the conversations on here will be able to give him a precursor to this and come up with a second edition of the Pincushion Effect. Now we're, the first one was written in 2011. So 13, 14 years later, maybe by 15 years later, by the time the book comes out. So I think it'll be a big difference in just the 15 years from the first time you wrote it. So, and you can see that just in the conversations of the introduction part leading into it before we even get to chapter one. I mean, there's so much powerful information in just the introduction. So I think these conversations are going to be a lot of fun. So I will turn it over to Mr. Williams, and I'm sure we'll all chime in, but you guys are all willing to unmute and chime in anytime you got conversations you want to add to it. So
yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah, exactly. And I will screen share the book for those that may not have it, but where are we at? Okay, there we go. Cool. And then I can highlight certain things, passages if you need to, whatever you need me to work on as well there, Williams. So
that works. So I figure we take the first little bit here, talk a little about the book. I've got a couple questions for Mr. Lucas to kind of get the discussion going, get his mindset about what he was thinking and why he wrote this book to really kind of help inform us. It's great to have the author here in order to kind of give us some perspective there, and then we'll jump right into it. But again, like Trent said, this is for you guys to discuss. It's not Trent and I as teachers, moderators is what our role is, and we want you guys to join in. And we've got a lot of new faces this round, which I'm really excited about. So please don't be afraid to ask questions, jump in here. We found, particularly in the last book, we ended up spending 3 or 4 weeks on one chapter when we thought we'd cruise right through it because the discussion was so robust. And that's what we want here is to really give feedback and strengthen our experienced surveyors and then raise our younger ones. So there's my little soapbox there. So to jump into this, Jeffrey, I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind taking a couple minutes here and talking about what inspired you to start this book and what you hope people got out of it. And then we can get into what we got out of it in our roundtable discussion.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that. Okay, I'd be glad to do that, Trent. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, obviously, well, maybe not so obviously. I started writing about the Pincushion Effect when I was in law school. I went to law school a little bit later in life, around 40. And one of the reasons I went to law school for many reasons, but one of the reasons was I had a 20-year career under my belt as a land surveyor, and I still didn't know what I was doing. I had read books like Evidence and Procedures. I had read Boundary Control and Legal Principles, and to be quite honest with you, a lot of it didn't make any sense, and it still doesn't make any sense. There was no rhyme or reason for certain things. I had no idea, and I was being taught, I was being taught and brought along by seasoned land surveyors. So this would have been, I started in land surveying full time January 2nd, 1976, as a butt chainman. Some of you might not know what a butt chainman is, but there's this thing called a chain It was a measuring a device about 100 feet long. In Florida, we use 200-foot chains. And there was a guy on the front end and a guy on the back end. The guy on the front end, he was the boss. I mean, he was in charge. And the guy on the back end was considered the butt chainman, head chainman and butt chainman. So I was taught as a surveyor, I was mentored that all we do is go out and drive irons in the ground according to what the deed has to say. The deed was sacrosanct. And any discussion about property rights, any discussion about anything else was taboo. We don't even know what a property right is. But it was kind of disturbing from the beginning when you start driving in pins right next to pins that are already there, breaking sections down again and again and again. And in Florida, that's easy to do because I grew up in surveying in Florida. That's easy to do because it's flat country and all the roads are going down section lines. So even back before GPS, you could easily break a section down, go to the four corners and break it down into its adequate parts. And then the worst thing to happen after you do that is then to actually go out there and start driving pins in the ground. I fully expected every day of work that we were doing any boundary work to drive up to an intersection and see multiple monuments in the pavement, PK nails, squares cut out of the asphalt where you took the square out and there was a pipe down below the asphalt. There would be pins, railroad spikes, multiple monuments, all ostensibly representing one corner in legal contemplation. So I had no idea why I was doing that, and I started to get troubled by that. I decided, you know what, I'm just going to, there were many reasons to go to law school. One was I had the time and the opportunity, and I had already seen the nexus between what we do as land surveyors, especially in the boundary arena, and the law, and being a lawyer. As a matter of fact, I believe that we have more in that retracement mode, in that boundary arena that we're in. We have more in common with the legal profession than we do with the engineering profession. And what we were doing at the time, this was the early 80s, all the way through the 80s. It wasn't until the late 90s that I went to law school. But we were treating boundaries like a math problem. We were treating boundaries like an engineering problem. All you got to do is find a couple. I mean, what do you need to be an expert measurer? All you need is a starting point and an azimuth. And what does Robillard say in the Brown book? All you need is 2 points. That gives you a starting point and an azimuth, and then you can be an expert measurer. And you can expertly and very precisely stake out the deed. But is that really what we're supposed to be doing? So I had questions, and I mean, and those questions started getting answered semester 1. And the biggest eye opener was my first semester. I took legal research and learned how to research the law, primarily the common law. And so I started working on this book. It wasn't going to be a book. I was just writing articles for the Alabama Society of Professional Land Surveyors. And it started out, I ended up writing about 3,000 words in about, I don't know, maybe a dozen, maybe a year's worth of editions about this problem right here, and what the law actually says, as opposed to the mythology that surveyors had created and still create to this day. Surveying a boundary, and I'm going to shut up here in a minute, let other people ask a question, but you open the door, Trent.
We did.
A lot of surveying practice today, even today, is pure mythology. It's a belief system. You just believe that you're supposed to go out and break the section down. You just believe you're supposed to go stake the deed, and that's all you're supposed to do. But no, you can't show me where it says in any version of the BLM manual where it says every time you go to a section, you're supposed to break. Every time you go to the center quarter, you're supposed to break that section down all anew, all over again. It doesn't say that, and the 2009 manual actually tells you what that process is, which is later on in the book. I think chapter 7, we'll talk about that. So I was disturbed. That's the reason, and I was disturbed about it. And I started working on that while I was still in law school. And then after that, I became a regular columnist for POB magazine in 2004. And I just continued working with it. And so I finally put it all together. That's the long answer to a very short question, Trent.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's great. I remember the first time you came to Utah was probably about the time that this book came out, and I was a much younger surveyor then, and I appreciate your perspective and the way you bring that, because I was stuck in that same mindset, right? As a surveyor coming, I actually started as a drafter, went to the field, and came back to the office, right, and applied what you've learned in the field, and I was trying to understand, how do we resolve a boundary? How do we take all that evidence and put it together and put it on a piece of paper? How do you break down a section? And I have some great mentors, but I've talked about this before in other sessions, is we have a mentoring problem to get from A to B. We have great mentors and great crew chiefs in the field that will teach their guys how to go and do a survey, right? Take the GPS. You've got to hit the fences. You've got to look for this. You look for the monuments. You look for the rivets. You do all that. But that's where that training kind of ends. And then you've got some pretty decent mentors in the office sometimes, but often it's well, you know how to do the field work. You know what all these points say. Draft it up and come up with a solution, right? Come up with a story to tell on paper. But we don't walk our young surveyors through that process of, how do you take that evidence? How do you not use this evidence, but do use this evidence? Weigh it here and weigh it here. So I appreciate your experience, because mine was somewhat similar in that, though I didn't then go to law school to figure it out. I'm relying on you to help me figure it out. So as I read through here, I've highlighted a few things, and the way we do this, again, just as a reminder, is we want you guys to speak up. We want to take what you've learned from this. Hey, I read this before and I'm reading it again and this popped out to me, or hey, this is something I didn't think about. So I'm going to point out a few things, and we'll turn it over to kind of the rest of the group to point out a few things here. But a couple of things I highlighted here is exactly what Trent's got on the page. Right in the middle of that second paragraph, it says, a corner does not have any physical characteristics. It is a legal concept derived from title to land and generally located on the ground from the description of property as found in a deed of conveyance. And so one of the things we really have to be careful about when we use this, we use these terms interchangeably, but I think it's going to be important that we are grammatically correct. Is a corner, as we talk about, is really a theoretical position, right? It's this deed, it's this ownership, it's this limits to the right, the convergence of two lines to create a corner, right? But that is the deed, the theory. And then the second paragraph down, a monument then, and just to read it here, a monument, on the other hand, is a physical object that is used to mark the corner. This is how we as surveyors say, we've taken the deed, or we are the original surveyors and we are creating a corner, but this is how we monument it on the ground for everyone to see from here on out. This is where we believe it to be true. And so a monument is the physical location of, if you will, the theoretical property corner from the paper or the deed or the survey plat or whatever it might be. Trent's highlighted, look at me, I didn't get here by myself.
That was my favorite line.
For a reason.
I love that.
So, and then that last thing in the paragraph, and I think you've already got it highlighted there. It says the point being there should be only one monument for every property corner, not two or more. When there is more than one, then a pincushion corner. Then it is a pincushion corner, and thus the pincushion effect, right? And that's exactly what we're trying to resolve. I actually do have. I shouldn't admit this, but in our kitchen here in my office, I've had other surveyors or even our own surveyors find our own caps next to each other, right? So I work for company Ensign Engineering. Got a few pictures of two Ensign caps within a couple tenths of each other, and we've created our own pincushion. So it's my wall of shame in our kitchen, just to remind our field crews not to do that. And it's pretty funny there, but we do it. And why do we do it? Part of that discussion, we'll get into that here, is our crews don't understand what our office guys are doing, and our office guys don't understand sometimes what our crews are doing, or the discussion is what happens when you find it. The next paragraph there, it says, many land surveyors do not see the pincushion corner as a problem. They see multiple monuments at a corner location as just a difference of opinion on the correct corner location. So I thought I'd throw this. I wrote a question here in my book here. Is that a pride thing, or I'm better than the other person, or is that a lack of training and education? Or we're going to get into a mindset. Jeffrey talks about kind of the mindset of surveyors and through time. So throw it out to the group here. Anyone want to kind of take a stab at that? Why do we see these corners?
Anybody can unmute.
Yeah, I mean, I think
there you go.
I think it's a twofold problem. I do think it's some miscommunication with the field and between the field and the office. I think sometimes potentially a crew is afraid to admit that they didn't find the corner the first time they looked, and maybe just set a pin. And I do think it boils down to a lot of what we've been taught. I think he talks about it in the intro that we were to, stake what was in the deed, and that was only what we were to do. And I think we also get confused how relative positional accuracy impacts whether we accept a monument or don't accept a monument. It really has nothing to do with whether we accept or don't accept. So there's just some of the things I think that have contributed to double corners or multiple corners.
Well, one of the things that I attribute it to, with 40 years of surveying experience under my belt, is it's a fundamental thing. I'll just go ahead and say it. The definition of surveying is so ambiguous. You can draw something up on almost basically on a kitchen, on a grocery store sack, and call it a survey. You can go out and stake out a deed. Now, okay, first let's talk about the basic concept, the fundamental principles of surveying. You're either an original surveyor or you're a retracement surveyor. There's nothing in between. So what is a deed stakeout?
The retracement.
It's not, you're not retracing. You're not following proper retracement theory if all you're doing is slapping the deed on the ground, because retracement theory says, in its most simple terms, we're following in the footsteps of the original surveyor. But you got to break that down just a little bit too, because who is the original surveyor? In most cases that I've dealt with surveying in 5 states here in the Southeast, I have no clue who the original surveyor was who set that center quarter. Now, who the GLO surveyor was, well, that can be found out. But the GLO surveyors didn't set all of the aliquot part corners, the 25 corners that represent a completely broken down section of 16 lots, 16 tracts, 16 quarters. So nobody knows who that. Generally, you don't know who the original surveyor is. How do you know? So how do you know you're following them? And if it's restricted, the retracement theory is restricted to following in the footsteps of an original surveyor, then half the work we do goes away, because nobody knows who the original surveyor was. And the original surveyor who set that center quarter could have been a farmer. Okay. So it's much deeper than that. It's and I talk about this, I think, in the next chapter is what our duty is as a retracement surveyor is to not necessarily follow in the footsteps of the original surveyor. What's the second part of that? Don't correct them. If you find an error, you don't correct them. More, I would say accurately, it's finding where the boundary line, and a retracement surveyor finds where the boundary lines have become established on the ground. That's our duty, where they have become established on the ground, which gets into a whole other discussion about establishment and the location document. So surveyors are allowed by our definition, to finish my thought, surveyors are allowed by definition to go out. We don't have a definition of a retracement survey in our standards, and certainly not in the Alta standards. We don't have a definition of an original survey in there. So what is it? All we have is we're all doing boundary surveys, okay? And not all boundary surveys are made equally. So you can pass muster under the technical standards or the standards of practice in your state by going and doing a deed stakeout, even though that is aberrant conduct relative to true retracement theory. As a matter of fact, if we were doing that in the medical profession, you would have your medical license taken away from you. But in the land surveying profession, the most egregious offenders become presidents of our state societies.
I'm a former president, Jeff.
Well, I was talking about you, Ryan, but I forgot you were on.
Well, thanks, Jeffrey. Dean's got his hand up here.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Mr. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dean.
I just wanted to comment on something that Mr. Lucas just said, is that, you can't correct the previous surveyor. And I can tell you that in Northern Virginia, which is where I do most of my work, it's like a whole other state here, but with our local jurisdictions, one of the requirements for final house location surveys to obtain your occupancy permits is that all property corners must be set. And there are a few subdivisions that were created in the early 1900s to 1930s, the community in particular named Pimmet Hills, where every single record plat has errors in it. And if you survey from the west to the east or east to the west, you get two different solutions. So being that, when we survey in that area, we find pincushions almost at every corner because no surveyor wants to rip out another corner, but they have to set the corner in order for their client to get the occupancy permit. So typically we try and show a tie to the corner, but if the inspector doesn't accept it, they will tell us we have to set it or they won't release the occupancy permit. So I think a lot of people are just stuck in a different position where, they're obeying the county inspector as opposed to standing by their belief as a surveyor. And I think that's where we see a lot of the pincushion effect.
It's interesting. I dealt with something not quite the same, but a similar vein, Dean, is we get stuck, and we'll get into this as we get into the rest of the introduction, chapter 1, is we get into this, the role of the surveyor over time. What we were esteemed, and then we kind of shot ourselves in the foot, and we're trying to climb our way back out, right? But I'm doing a subdivision plat in the city that I work. It's the actual city our office is in, and hit section corners, broke down the section to do the retracement survey over the overall property, created a subdivision plat to split one lot off to build a new home on it. But in all my evidence and review of everything, the best place to hold and the closest monuments to hold were the centerline monuments in the street of adjacent subdivisions. Once I held those, everything, all the deeds fit perfectly. It was really clean. So I show that on my survey, and I show that on my subdivision plat, and the city rejects my subdivision plat because they are the land use authority. And so all of a sudden we're pushed up against, you know, this governing or regulating authority, right? They rejected it because in their deeds or in their ordinances, every subdivision has to be tied to a PLSS monument. You know, forget the fact that the centerline monument is a witness to that section corner because it is tied to it on the face of that plat. But that is a real problem that many of us face, is we've got this theory and practice that we understand or starting to understand better, but then you're forced into a lot of other things by regulatory authorities. And I think that's what you're experiencing here. And part of it's a matter of education, state societies, county surveyors, local surveyors getting involved and having those discussions with the cities and governing authorities to help them understand how we do what we do. Because I think they just don't understand. Oh yeah, just set a corner there. Can't you just go do that? Here's the map. Here's the GIS. This is what our map shows. Go put it there.
Well, if the question is, why do we have pincushion corners? I think Jeff Lucas hit the nail on the head. And that is, majority of our surveyors don't know what they're doing. That's what he said. That's what he meant. I agree with him 100%. Now, the effect of a pincushion cover, a corner, is a problem for us because it totally undermines the confidence that the public has in us and our profession. What we do about it, there might be a lot of different ideas about how to overcome this, but it's the initial reason that they're out there is that surveyors set corners based on the evidence they uncovered, and they're failing to uncover all of the evidence. They're failing to apply the proper legal principles to that evidence, and they come up with something that's different. And they will not call a surveyor who was before them and say, I've got a problem. Can we get together and see if we can put our evidence together and come up with something we can agree on? Surveyors in my area don't do that. I've called surveyors back when I was in practice and offered to do that. That's a situation they're not going to get paid for. There's no money in it, and they have no interest in it. About the second time I called a surveyor and I got that is the last time I called that surveyor. I'll see him in court if we wind up there, and I'll tan his eye. That's all I've got to say there with that one question.
Yeah. Well, and Lori threw, thanks, James. Lori threw in the chat here. She says, I guess in PLS states it's easier to figure out the original surveyor. Not necessarily. You know, if it's a subdivision plat, certainly there's names tied to that. But we're still dealing with deeds that have, you know, could be written by a title company. Or I see quite often, you know, dealing with one that this deed has been written by the county as a remnant over, you know, remnant deed, and, you know, is what it is. But that became the deed of record because someone copied that in the next cell and the next cell and the next cell, and they become the, you know, the writer of that description. So it can be difficult here too as well. Matthew, you got your hand up.
I want to bring up one more point here, and that is about this original survey. I think we overuse that, and we don't really know what we're talking about. What is the original survey? The first survey that was done, the third survey that was done, the one that was done correctly? What gives that original survey some authority over other surveys? It comes from the intent of a conveyance. If a conveyance does not directly or indirectly call for that survey, it doesn't mean anything. And the corners that were set in it don't mean anything. You need to validate a corner or a survey. It needs to be mentioned directly or indirectly in a conveyance. That's where the authority comes from. It's not because it was original, not because it was the first guy out there. It's because it was demanded in the conveyance. Some deeds or conveyances don't have an original surveyor. And in that case, there is no original surveyor. And it's not going to be the first guy on the ground that sets pins that produces something that's authoritative and conclusive against the landowners. So now you understand a little bit about why I say our surveyors out there don't really know what they're doing. Go ahead.
I want to get back to that, but I want to let Matthew finish his thought. And I've got some questions about original surveyor. I like that thread of discussion. Matthew, go ahead.
All right, thanks for calling on me. I really feel what James is saying. I think we've all felt it, where we have this visceral reaction to surveyors who we quote, they don't know what they're doing. And for feedback for Jeff, the introduction to this book was very comforting for me. The way it's explained about the history, and you were talking about this a little bit earlier, Trent, the history of surveying as being professional, and then the pendulum swinging to a technician, and then now we're back and swinging the other way again. But we're left with these remnants, and we're left with the garbage that came from this other era. And I always felt like, what is going on in our profession? Why are there these discrepancies about the definition of surveying or what we're doing? And I found that introduction really settled me, and a lot of my frustration kind of eased, because I can understand now where these surveyors are coming from. And I just think that's really important to bring back up, as frustrated as we get, and as intense as the feelings get about why we think we're right versus a technician's point of view, is that Jeff has really brought it up in this introduction. Now there was a reason why this happened in our profession, and it's really clearly outlined. And if you haven't read the introduction and you jump back into this book, please don't skip it. I think it's really a powerful introduction in that manner.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
I like this whole section where you talked about, that they were contract surveyors and then settled down in communities, became the, local surveyors, county surveyors, and then really took on, like I highlighted here, took on their bad habits, and, maybe were great surveyors or not great surveyors, and created the mess from there too. So I thought that was a great point as well, to Matt's point.
Yeah. Thanks guys. So I want to maybe take this thread that James threw out there, and I know Jeffrey's talked about it in some of his presentations, and if you haven't, he did a podcast for a little while on something. What was the radio station? That was a really good podcast, but I got sucked into that for a while when he spent a couple weeks talking about the original surveyor, and then this second surveyor that comes in to correct it, right? And we've talked about that we're not coming in to correct it. But anyone want to take a stab in talking about original surveyor? And I think this discussion might be interesting when we look regionally about what that is, because one of the points James brought up is there may be deeds that don't have a quote unquote original surveyor. So I'll throw that back out to the group. Anyone have any thoughts on how do we define or give clarity to that term we use often? John, you unmuted yourself. Do you want to take a stab at it?
Sure, I'll give a shot. Yeah, this it's kind of a quandary that really, when I first started surveying was about 1975, and the seminars and stuff that I was going to, and the speakers that we were listening to at the time, Madsen was one of them. He was the extremist in the bunch. I always accused him of being John the Baptist, getting his head served on a platter by the profession. But um, the there's this seeming gap between, okay, when you have original surveyor, like we like to think about us as a surveyors, we like to think, okay, that's the surveyor who went out before the conveyance, wrote the deed did the survey, marked it on the ground, wrote the deed, the description, and called for the monuments that they had set, and then gave that description to the landowner who incorporated it in the conveyance document. Conveyance document goes in the record, and you're now conveyance document creates the boundary, and the survey now markers that were just markers out there, random markers in the field until that point. There was no boundary. So the deed now creates the boundary because it separates the two estates. So there's a boundary between two contiguous properties. And those survey markers are imbued with that authority because they're called for in the conveyance document. So you have these four things that really happen to make a monument control. Well, then what about the guy who sells the west 10 acres of his property and doesn't get a survey? Are they to never know where that boundary is? No, eventually somebody's got to go out there and survey it for the first time. Well, in the 80s, early 80s, 90s, it was promoted that, well, we'll just call that person the first surveyor, not the original surveyor, because as long as he does his job correctly, follows the instructions that are handed down in that written deed, and follows those instructions properly and lays it out within whatever standard of care is applicable at the time, with the techniques and equipment at the time, then you can accept it. But if he makes a blunder, or if he does something wrong, or if you disagree with, for whatever reason, with his accuracy or precision that he used on setting those points, or the method he used to set those points, then you reject those corners offhand because they're not controlling, because they're not original and not called for in the conveyance. So it was just his opinion, and nothing more. And you disagree with that opinion, so fine, I'll set my own corner and say, yeah, he's wrong, I'm right. And then it falls into that pride thing that was mentioned earlier. Or the I can survey or I can measure better than that guy type of issue. But this first surveyor doctrine thing, when you start looking at it, eventually it appears in Brown's, about the third or fourth edition, I think, in Brown's. He incorporates this first surveyor doctrine idea. And in all the cases I've reviewed, the only first surveyor the courts ever mention is the original surveyor. And there's never a first surveyor. You have an original surveyor and a retracement surveyor. There's no gap. And so you start really reading what the courts are saying. They're not talking about, in every case, the monuments are called for in the conveyance documents. What they're talking about is the four principles. You got monuments that were placed on the ground intended to represent the boundary. The monuments were relied upon as marking the boundary, and the monuments are discoverable and retraceable and can be linked back to that document or back to the parcel that's being marked on the ground. And whatever the fourth one was, I can't think of it at this moment. But those four requirements are met by that first surveyor who lays it out. What he's doing is he's following the written instructions of the landowner instead of the original surveyor who's following the oral instructions of the landowner. The landowner tells him, I want the west 10, he wants you to survey the west 10 acres. So he does it, so marks it out, right? What's the difference with picking up the deed that says the west 10 acres of the property? And aren't they just going to now pick it up and follow those same instructions from the same landowner and mark it out on the ground for the very first time? And the courts don't seem to really differentiate like we do in our profession, the difference between those two. Undoubtedly a called for monument in the conveyance document. You can link it directly. You can find it existent, undisturbed, identifiable, all those characteristics. Yes, it controls that original survey or becomes the best evidence of that original survey. But the first surveyor's monuments that are set on the ground, they'll never be part of the deed. They're never included in the deed. How many of us set one today or last week? Went out and surveyed a boundary and didn't find the monument, so you set a rebar and cap there or whatever kind of a monument and say, yeah, there's my opinion on where the corner is. Well, it's not called for in the deed, so therefore it doesn't control. It'll never control. The parties will never know until they get the perfect survey to know exactly where it is. And each subsequent surveyor is going to disagree with the one prior. And we end up with all these pincushion corners, just expressing a variance of opinions when no, there's one corner, and the first surveyor who establishes that position on the ground and that's relied upon and accepted by the owners will control.
Well, why would a landowner even hire a surveyor if they knew that secret, right? Hey, this is my opinion. I'm retracing the deed. I put it here, but someone else could change it because they have a different opinion, and so you still don't know where your corner is. So you've hired someone to tell you where your corner is. Mm-hmm. If the public knew that, why would they ever hire us? There becomes no point.
Because we are by law the only profession in the country who can survey a piece of property and mark that corner. Anybody else does it. It's a practice of surveying without a license. Now you can say, well, the landowner could survey his own property. Yeah, as long as he's standing toe to toe with his neighbor when they do it, so that they can come to an agreement that this is where the corner is for whatever reason. Yeah, they can have an agreement to do that. And don't need a surveyor to do that. And we have plenty of court cases where that's been the case. And the courts have upheld the landowner's establishment of that corner, knowing that it's in the wrong place. And then when we talk about, yeah, it's in the wrong place, technically there isn't a monument out there that's in the right place. Maybe the principal point, the principal meridian point, but the first half mile that they went north, south, east, or west from that principal point is not north, south, east, or west, and it's not 2,640 feet. So every monument out there is wrong by some degree, and hopefully the measurable degree that it's off is small and insignificant enough that people don't care. But yeah, that's the monument. That's the accepted corner. There, leave it at that. It's there. I found I found the corner, found the monument.
I agree so much with what John has just said right there. And but you can make it a little more complicated and then see a little bit more about, I think, what it is that we're trying to do. Let's say that Mr. Jones decides to sell a part of his property to Mr. Smith, and they get together and decide about exactly what they think they want to buy and sell, and they hire a surveyor to come out and survey it, and he does so and produces a description of that property. But that sale falls through, and a short time later, Mr. Black shows up and says he would like to buy some land. And Mr. Smith shows him what the first thing was in the boundary. And he says, well, that's pretty good. That's about what I want. But over here in this area right here, I want a little more. Mm-hmm. And it's really, it's a thing that's easy to describe.
Yeah,
they hire a second surveyor to come out and make that, to make that correction there to the first surveyor's work for the additional little piece that's going to be added on there. Now then, he helps them do a description that is a combination of the first description provided by the first surveyor in his new adjustment to that. And that's conveyance that goes through. Now you've got two surveys, and one of them is for part of the tract, and the second survey is for the other part of the tract. So you have what I would call there two original surveys, but it's the first survey is controlling on that part of the description that the conveyance used, and you are commanded or directed to follow in the footsteps of that first guy on that portion of the tract. But on the second portion, the added on portion, you've got to follow in the footsteps of the second surveyor, because those elements are part of the conveyance. And it is the intent of the conveyance that drives what we should do, not anything else.
Right. And I would say to those points there that the first survey, there never was a boundary created because there never was a conveyance. You have to have a conveyance in order to have two parcels created and separate a landowner's estate, because you have to have two different owners, one on each side of the boundary, to have a boundary. So they can't create a boundary across their own piece of property, and there was never any conveyance to record with the first survey. So the second surveyor comes along and, okay, here's now the line where that second survey, you can retrace that line, and because that's where the boundary was ultimately created, was that second document. Now, whether it remains as two descriptions, one description, whatever, that's the description that creates the boundary, or a conveyance document that creates the boundary. And so there's nothing to survey, there's no boundary to retrace necessarily. And yes, that second one, retracing that second boundary now, or that second the boundary that actually got created by the second conveyance, may certainly require the surveyor to retrace the first survey and then use a pocket tape to measure over the additional 10 feet that they bought. And maybe that was never monumented too. Maybe it was, but it's going to lead them to the discovery and the proof, or the corroborative evidence that these are the second set of monuments. So the first survey still has value as evidence to the location of the second line, the second survey, but I would not have evidence as to a boundary because one was never created.
The boundary is created by the actual sale of the whole property, and it indirectly brings into that conveyance the first monuments that were set in the first survey. So in essence, it is creates a tract based upon partially the first survey and partially on the second survey. And I think you have to follow in the footsteps of both of those.
Well, certainly this first survey would provide evidence to support the second, but the second one is the only one that actually has a boundary, that actually is a boundary line and that's monumented on the ground.
Why is the second survey have any authority on? It has only authority because it was directed, or it was mentioned within the conveyance. It was the conveyance that made that one authoritative for that part of the boundary, but it also, because it was indirectly brought in by the monuments of the first survey, it too is a part of that conveyance. And so that boundary is determined by the first survey. The other part is determined by the second survey. I don't see a problem there.
I think let's just hit pause here a second, guys. Yeah. I think we're getting away from the content of the book a little bit. We're still in the introduction here. We're getting into the weeds. Exactly. I think those are discussions we can have, but let's maybe save them for some other chapters. So for the purpose of this meeting or this chapter, the introduction here, I mean, what we tried to do is define original survey. I think Lori asked a really great question here that kind of helps define what the question is and why I asked the question. So she asked, so the original survey should be considered the first survey of a conveyance when there is an adjoining property, not, for an example, an original GLO survey. So there's kind of some we're talking nuance here. So you have the original survey that breaks down a section, particularly in the PLSS states, right? Someone's gone in, but for the deeds within there, right, you have to retrace and work within that box, the section that the property's in. So in that case, you are the subsequent surveyor, right? You have to work in and follow the surveyor, the footsteps of the original surveyor that broke down the section that you're working in. But in many instances, there might be an original surveyor for a breakdown of a tract. For example, inside a quarter of a section, we go do a new subdivision. We create new lots, new divisions in there. So that surveyor then becomes the original surveyor within that division of land, inside a division of land. We're never going to be the true original surveyor of anything because it's all been broken down at some point, but we become an original surveyor. And someone can correct me if I'm explaining this poorly or wrong, but we become the original surveyor of a breakdown of land when we're actually creating a separation of that, because we are surveying that separation and become the first that has instructions from the landowner, like John talked about. Go break this down, and whether the conveyance document or a plat or the oral instructions, we are conveying the intent of the landowner to become an original surveyor to break down a new division of a land. But it's always going to be in some other original surveyor's bigger division.
So Trent, if an original monument placed by, I'm speaking about PLS surveys. If an original,
they should all be on.
Go ahead, Lori.
Okay. If an original survey is a lot of times with the contract surveys, in remote areas or very difficult terrain, the surveyors didn't always do what they said they did. So we have that issue. And then we also have an issue of monuments being placed in the wrong place. But in reality, if that's the original survey, it's not the wrong place, even if it's where it's not supposed to be. And so as I understand it, I'm a fairly new surveyor, that monument holds. Right.
The monument being, back to our original very first part of this introduction, right? The corner, whether it's a section corner, property corner, that is a theoretical either by statute, right, in the section corner case.
Idea.
It's an idea. We've broken down the entire country into 1 mile squares, as John talked about. The second you measure 1 foot off of that initial point, you're wrong. Right. But the physical location of that, hey, as Mr. Lucas put in his book, hey, I've put something here, I wasn't put here naturally, and it becomes relied upon. No one's argued that. No one's come in, particularly in the GLO case, no one's come in for hundreds of years and said, hey, the government did something wrong here. The corner's not where it's supposed to be. It needs to be corrected. They've held that as a line. Mm-hmm. Well, intent, time, mm-hmm. the lack of dispute, monuments that is true, we acquiesce to it, if you will, and that becomes true. Whether or not it was theoretically placed correct, it becomes correct because everyone's let it be correct over time, over documents, mm-hmm. over whatever it might be.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great discussion. I love it.
Trent.
Any other questions on that?
Hey, Trent.
Yeah.
Let me just add a couple things and I'll try to be short.
Go for it.
The way I look at it, which I think is a very simple way of looking at it, you can't be an original surveyor without unity of ownership. You got to have a common grantor. Without a common grantor, you can never be an original surveyor. And you touched on it. You got a quarter of a section, somebody owns the entire quarter of a section, or a joint venture owns it, multiple people own it, but there's unity of ownership and they want it to be subdivided. The surveyor goes out and sets those lines on the ground is the original surveyor, conveyance or not. They're putting the lots up for sale. Ostensibly, you would think they get conveyed, but regardless, unity of ownership is what you look, at least in my mind, is what you look at. You don't have unity of ownership, which you don't when you're doing a pincushion, when you're doing a deed stakeout. There's no unity of ownership. You cannot re-subdivide property that's already been subdivided. It's illegitimate. It's not an original survey. It's not a retracement survey. The other thing was to Lori's question. It's not about the first surveyor, the second surveyor. It's unity of ownership. But so why are original monuments so important? What's the big deal about an original monument? And why is the original surveyor ostensibly infallible? See, the focus for too many surveyors, and especially in the public land survey states, is on what the surveyor did or did not do. In the public land survey system, according to the BLM's manual, whatever, what they wrote, maybe they don't have any authority at all, but they're the agency for the Interior Department on surveys, like the IRS. I guess they have a little bit of power. The focus in the manual has nothing to do with the surveyor. The surveyor is a tool. The
Some days
focus
I
is
feel
on
like
what
that.
the focus is on what the people did or did not do. What they're reliant. The reason original monument, whoever sets it, is an original monument is because the people who came into that subdivision and glommed on to those, when they accepted those corners and those lines between the corners, their property rights did nothing less than attach to those lines and to those monuments. Go read Cooley. The surveyor's irrelevant. It's the important thing is, what did the people do? They went in and they bought lots based on those monuments. And when they went in reliance on those monuments, their property rights attached. Now, I know as surveyors, we don't like to talk about property rights, but you know what? When you start messing around with people's property boundaries, you're messing around with property rights. It's all about property rights. The whole thing, surveying, is all about the people. The surveyors are almost totally irrelevant. And surveyors just can't wrap their brain around that. We can't be irrelevant, but we can't be irrelevant. We've got to be the center of attention. It's all about us. Proper procedure. It's all about us. Who cares about the people? It's all about us. We are narcissistic. What we do almost doesn't matter. And the other thing is, time is on our side. You make a blunder and enough time goes by, what was a blunder is not correct. And it's that simple. 20 years we should have a statute of limitations on boundary. After 20 years, it's a done deal because all states, there's a rule of repose at some point in time. Life is too short. We don't have time for all this ancient controversy crap coming up. We're not going to deal with it. It's called the rule of repose. It's an ultimate statute of limitations. Although it's not a statute, it's a court-made rule. But we're the only people on God's green earth, surveyors, God's green earth, who are actively looking for crap to bring up. Nobody else wants to do it. There's a statute of limitations for every activity under the sun in the civil context, right? There's a statute of limitations for every activity under the sun in the United States of America, other than criminal activity. There's got to be an end. There's got to be an end to litigation. Society wants it. The only people who are looking for ancient controversies were surveyors. We're the only people. And you know who loves them when we find them? The attorneys. The attorneys will make $50,000, $60,000 off that controversy that the surveyor found for $3,000. Now who's the chump?
Absolutely.
Okay. I said I was going to make it short. So I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
hey, that's short for you, Lucas. You know that. And then in the chat, Dean says, "I'm feeling pretty good about my career choices right now."
Absolutely.
And
Okay.
then just one more point. Mr. Dahl, the BLM writer for 2009 manual, joined us as well. So I was throwing that out there for you, Mr. Lucas.
Oh, great. I'd love to talk to him. Matter of fact, he's the one who, as far as I could tell, he is the one who edited the 2009 manual and made some things pretty crystal clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's great to have you, Bob. So
Okay, well, we're an hour into this. We're not even through the introduction. I love it.
we're through
I
the
think
7
we're about
paragraphs of
there.
introduction.
I think we're about there. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to hit real fast. Let's see. Where are you at on your page there, Trent? So I'm on page 4 and 5 in the actual paper book there, the top of 4. Right there, yeah, you got it highlighted. So it says the essence of retracement survey is to find where the original lines were established, not to correct those lines, to establish new ones. These two concepts are confused. Pincushions are generally the result. So we've hashed that one out. We go 3 paragraphs down there where it says and any and everything happened in this transaction period. So we start talking about, we've hinted at this, but I want to read just a few things of the role of surveyor through time here in the United States. And it's really kind of the middle of that. I'll just read the whole thing. Any and everything happened in this transition period between the original PLSS surveys and further subdivision of these sections. Some of these local surveyors continue to act as if they were creating boundaries, as they had during the PLSS surveys, instead of retracing boundaries, as was their new calling. So it's just a change in function, but they didn't change their actions there. Others accepted the new role and made diligent efforts to follow procedure and maintain accurate records. This new role of the surveyor as a retracement expert, an arbiter over disputed property boundaries, and even as a quasi-judicial officer was articulated in a paper published by Thomas M. Cooley. And we're all familiar with that. That's the first thing we hear about when we go into Introduction to Survey in school, right? Our role is not to upset the apple cart. It is to keep the status quo wherever we can and to follow in the footsteps. And just following in then the next paragraph. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new wind began to blow in from the west. It was deemed no longer the function of the land surveyor to be a quasi-judicial officer or even an arbiter over disputed boundaries. The surveyor's role was seen as simply a finder of facts related to a deed, no matter how flawed, and to report those findings to the proper authorities, the landowner or the landowners, the attorney, whoever it might be. And then just the last sentence there, given the state of land surveying profession in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, it's little wonder that this wind was able to fan a fire that has now nearly consumed the profession of land surveying, leaving only behind charred remnants of what was once a proud and sturdy profession. And I'm excited to see that the movement of Mentoring Mondays, Wisdom Wednesdays, we're seeing a shift back into this discussion of our quasi-judicial role. As Mr. Lucas just said, there's no way to talk about boundary lines, boundary locations, without all the baggage that's tied to them. As much as we'd like to pretend that that's an attorney's role, the second we make a boundary determination, we inform an attorney or a landowner where their possible rights go to. We don't talk about what those rights are, but we are talking about limits to those rights. And as much or as little as we want to give heed to that, by simply saying, here's a boundary, a landowner here's where my rights end. And we can't do our function without understanding the unintended consequences of determining a boundary because a landowner relies on that. I have this discussion often when someone calls in and they want a fence line survey. to give them the cost. Oh, that's so expensive. I'm placing my fences, and I have to explain to them, the second I tell you where to put that fence, even if I give you sign a document waiving all my, liability. The second I tell you where to put that fence, that's where your property line is, even if I give you every warning that it's not accurate. You rely on that. And that's why I have to follow my role as a surveyor to do a full retracement. I can't just go cheap, put a fence in, not do my survey, not record a record of survey. You rely on it, even if I tell you not to.
Trent, let me piggyback on that.
Absolutely.
What I found after 40 years of practicing surveying, and surveyors love to say this, the people don't know what we do. They don't understand us. They don't know, what we go through. We're the Rodney Dangerfields of the profession. Nobody understands it. Well, there's two things they understand about us very well. We're the people standing on the side of the road taking pictures with that camera thingy. And when we wrap the pink flagging around their rebar, we are showing them what they own, the limits of ownership. And even Curtis Brown, in his 1979 article, Surveyor's Responsibility for Unwritten Rights. There's a lot of problems with unwritten rights. But anyway, in that 1979 column that he wrote, he actually gave it was a speech at the New Mexico Association of Surveyors, but it later got reprinted in the old Surveying and Mapping magazine of the ACSM. He admitted that. He said, if you ask, and I'm paraphrasing, if you ask people what they think a surveyor is doing and what they think that and what they want the surveyor to do, they want the surveyor to show them what they own. And so he made a big deal out of it, said, because he was the father of deed staking. He said, in my early years, I used to advocate that surveyors are to simply stake out the deed and leave the results for the people to deal with and the attorneys to deal with. They can't sue you anyway, even if they wanted to. And besides that, you're just staking out their deed. How can you have any liability over that? Well, he basically said, I was wrong. And it was based on that case he was talking about, which was Western Title versus McCormick, which was not a published opinion, but Ted Madsen covered it in The Anatomy of a Survey Disaster. And so Brown, the father of deed staking, turned around and said, no, not so much. And then he got criticized. Just eviscerated over that stance in editorials in letters to the editor that came in after that, which were generally published. He became, they accused him of being a fence line surveyor because it was a fence. It was a fence. That was the issue. That was the boundary. And the surveyor failed to recognize that the boundary line was along the fence, and so on and so forth. But anyway, point being that Brown recanted. He pulled off. He I don't know when he passed away. It was shortly thereafter, but he disavowed. He said, if you're going to just go stake the client's deed instead of showing them what they own, you've got to make that absolutely clear to the client that that's what you're doing. Curtis Maitland Brown, 1979. Surveyor's Responsibility for Unwritten Rights. I have some of it in the book.
Yep, just a couple pages over here, you quote that one. Reference that in the book here. Even Curtis Brown, an early advocate for the fact finder role for the land surveyor, came off his earlier stance, but all but recanted his 1979 article. I'm going to just continue in here. There's a couple as we finish this thread. We'll just get through the introduction tonight, so I'm going to push this one out just a little bit. So it says, the new wind, however, was and still is being met with great resistance. Land surveyors who have become accustomed to applying mathematical formulas to solve problems that don't necessarily involve math are resistant to the idea that math isn't the solution to a boundary problem. And here's the hardest part. And the reason for that, I believe, is math is a yes or no question. It's easy. There's no opinion. It's come off the corner, come off the monument, go around the four corners. There is no thinking. You know, surveying in its true essence takes thought and process and evaluation, common sense. You know, there is a lot that goes into it. It really is a very hard thing to do, especially when the boundaries become difficult. But math is easy. It's a yes or no.
Problem with many students have is that math is black and white, just like you said. It's easy to understand. It's right or wrong. And surveying is gray. Everything that we do pretty much is a gray field. And a lot of students have a hard time understanding that grayness or accepting it.
That's where the famous line, "It depends," comes from.
Amen.
I'd like to leave everybody with one more thing, and that is the American Bar Association has a website. That's the same bar association that runs across the country. And there's an article published there that's entitled something like what every lawyer should know about title property surveyors. And that's some interesting read, because those guys expect us to do a really thorough job of understanding what the total record is, evidence is on a piece of property. They expect us to understand the physical monuments or physical evidence that we will find in the field, and they expect us to apply the law to that to come up with a reasonable answer to the location of the ownership boundaries. That's what they expect. And that is essentially a specialized practice of law. Because I can tell you, if you change the subject from land to something like contracts, if you ran an ad in the local paper that you would issue a professional opinion on a partially completed contract and tell the people what their rights and obligations were, that the bar association would be down on you like a hawk on a chicken for practicing law without a license. The only difference with us is the subject is land. We're not in a position where we can represent a client in a legal proceeding, but as far as determining and giving an opinion to the location of a boundary, that's within the practice of surveyor, and it's tantamount to a special practice of law. We should understand what law is, or we're not going to be competent surveyors, and we're going to keep putting pins out there that don't match up with each other. We won't come to any agreement. The lawyers understand that that is a professional opinion, and just like lawyers will occasionally differ in what a law applies to a certain fact situation, we will occasionally differ in our location of a boundary. They expect that.
Whatever lawyer needs to know is confined to those 11 pages that Trent pulled down there. All 11 pages. That's our entire survey knowledge. That's all we get.
Yeah, I just threw that in the chat. So do you know when that was written, James? There's not a published date on there, but
I'm not sure what the published date of it is.
1986.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
I have it quoted in parts of the book, Williams and Onsred. They were both attorneys. Williams was also a surveyor, and they were writing that article in response to the latest version of the Alta standards coming out.
Ah, okay.
Okay, great.
Nice.
Recommended reading.
Yep. I'll make sure I get it on the website as well, but or at least throw a link to it. So
Yeah, and
On
you
the
throw a book, the guide, the whole book there. That should
Yeah.
be next year's book, Trent. That might be an interesting one. It's one that none of us have probably read or studied as a majority thing. It would be really interesting to see that perspective.
yep.
Jocelyn threw in the chat here that she says it depends so many times when answering students' questions in class, and that's hard. That is hard, and that was one of my frustrations. I've talked about this before, but when I started going to professional society meetings, and we had people like Jeffrey Lucas or John Stahl that go around and do these they're national speakers, right? And we've got other people in here that do that, and other ones that we could name off, and even local surveyors. But as a young surveyor getting into this, we would open up some old BLM or GLO map, and we would talk about this really rare instance, and here's all the research that went into it, and here's how the BLM broke this down, and here's all, and then everyone would start discussing, well, what about this, and what about that? We would get all these questions from every different surveyor in that, 100 different in the classroom, and I would get so lost and frustrated with the what it depends, because I'm still just trying to learn the basics, and then we're getting into the weeds of this really rare and unique BLM boundary issue that's gone to whatever higher court, and it was washing over me. I got lost and frustrated, and almost turned me away from the profession. It was really hard to follow. But that is the challenge that we have as mentors, or Jocelyn as an instructor, of how do we teach the students to evaluate. It's a discussion we have on the education committee as we work with local schools, and that of what do we need out of future surveyors, out of students graduating from high school. The critical thinking skills of evaluation is a hard one, and so that's a tough one to teach. But I maybe as just a side note here, and you may do this. I have not attended one of your classes, but there might be some great opportunities to let them talk about what are the differences, right? And how would you, well, you have this unique case, what would you do, right? And let them go down that rabbit hole themselves. Because the hardest thing is that depends. We end the discussion. Well, what does it depend on, right?
Right. So can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
I teach an intro class, so it's very basic stuff. And I actually used part of the intro to this book when we were discussing the difference between corners and monuments. And so somebody asked a question about, well, what if this? And, describes a scenario. And my answer is almost always, it depends. Like, you have to start looking at these other facts and evidence and do this extra research. And one of the things I've really stressed to my students, I talk to them about this on day one, is exactly like you said, there's a lot of gray area in this profession. And if you look at it as that's exciting and I get to research this and I get to put these pieces together, then this is probably the career for you. If you hear that and instantly panic and think, I can't deal with a gray area, like maybe we need to talk about switching to a different class, because it's like that for the rest of your career. Unless, I don't know, maybe you only do construction staking and get calc points or something. I don't know.
There's still gray area in that, because you've got to make determinations. Trust me.
Yeah.
Jocelyn, that's why I went to law school.
That's awesome.
But it's
a lot of gray area.
Yeah. Now when I say it, they all kind of laugh, because I tell them, I think on the first night, I will say that so many times throughout the semester, and we'll go through the different options and different scenarios, in ways they can understand as intro students. But it's a lot of fun. They get a kick out of it too every time I say it now.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, it's hard, especially with an intro one to delve into that. Depends, but it is important that we don't end it there, because I've heard too many surveyor presenters. Well, it depends, and you're left without that knowledge. So thank you for clarifying that and then doing that as well. I'm just going to jump to the last page, Trent, of the introduction here. And it says here, the text is being written to address both the mind-boggling aspects of pincushion corners and the exasperation of the pincushion effect. Although there is very little that can be done to correct the damage that has already been inflicted by pincushions, much can be done to stop their seeming exponential growth and prevent new ones from forming where they do not already exist. Quoting Justice Cooley from the famous Michigan case, Delver Sanger, nothing is better understood than a few of our early plats that will stand the test of careful and accurate survey without disclosing errors. This is as true of the government surveys as of any others, and if all the lines were now subject to correction on new surveys, the confusion of lines and titles that would follow would cause consternation in many communities. Indeed, the mischiefs that must follow would be simply incalculable, and the visitation of the surveyor might well be set down as a great public calamity. He finishes, indeed, the great public calamity is to be avoided at all cost, especially at the hands of the land surveyor. That is the direction we are headed with this book, avoiding the great public calamity. So if there was ever a doomsday closing to an introduction, but for us that understand what we're getting into here, what a great opportunity we have. This is to Trent Keenan's to benefit. He has taken what he's done, mentoring Mondays, allowed me to moderate Wisdom Wednesdays, but we have this great movement. We have 20, we've almost had 31 people today jump in, about 45 registered. I've got emails and notes from people that watch these after the fact because they can't make it live. There is a shift in the profession, and I'm really excited to see the shift that happens as we go through this book together. And I met with Jeremiah Cunningham, that's usually on here with us, another Utah surveyor, and we were talking about our upcoming professional society conference in February, and he's putting a presentation together for that. And I am so proud, if I can boast here a second, how my surveys have changed in the last 3 years, how much better they've become because of you guys and your discussions and what you bring to the table and the books we've read. I've read these. I hadn't gone through in depth the Pincushion Effect, but like Waddles last year, I'd read that in class. It was required reading. And what I understand now is far more than what I understood when I read that the first time. And I have changed what I do because of what you guys have brought here. So thank you for that. There's my little sappy moment. Any other questions, comments about the discussion tonight?
Trent, let me just make a couple of comments on what you just said. I think you guys are doing a great job. I've been involved in Mentoring Mondays a couple of times, but with my invite to go over the Pincushion book, I'm going to make it a priority to attend as many of these as I can. Also, when I wrote the Pincushion Effect, started writing it probably about the year 2000, and I actually put the book together in probably 2009. The copyright 2010 or 11, anyway, somewhere around there. There was a lot of pushback on what we're talking about. A lot, the pushback was heavy. I got flaming arrow emails. Of course, I was writing in POB magazine, and I was bent. I was angry. I was exposing every survey crap case that I could find. I changed my ways, by the way, on that. But I have seen a difference. I mean, they wanted to kill me in Washington State the first time I went there. They wanted to lynch me. Last time I went there, they're all agreeing with me. What happened? I don't know. So Missouri's still a tough one, but anyway, so I applaud you guys. This has been great, and I'm looking forward to to continuing with this discussion.
It was amazing to have you, to have the insight. We were fortunate to have Nettleman when we did evidence as well, and so to have the author's input on these conversations is invaluable for sure. So it's we only made it through the introduction, but all we're gonna do is just drag it on. It is what it is. But we got until next basically June 1st to get this done. So we can drag it out as long as we want. So we'll have some amazing conversations. I know that. And so
I'm excited for next one. We'll get into what is our role, technicians versus professionals, duties as a surveyor, what makes us professionals, what sets us apart. So it should be some good discussion that lends to previous discussions of the other books, and I think this will give some good clarity to what we've talked about.
And as a quick little hint, there is the graphic for Utah's conference next year.
Nice.
I was working with
Hey, Trent, I can see the butt chainman in that picture.
See, there he is.
There he is. I didn't look that cool when I was a butt chainman, though.
All right. January 2nd, 1976, right there. That's awesome. All right, everybody. We are back with mentoring this coming Monday. So we'll have a good one there, and we'll get going again. So I appreciate everybody's time. This was amazing, and looking forward to chapter 1. Thanks, Jeff, for jumping on, and everybody else. It's been great.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
Awesome.
Appreciate your discussion.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.